notes on the earliest people. Let's see. Labor on the early farms. I got to get this message off here. Okay. Labor on the early farms was almost entirely indentured servants, primarily English and Irish. This was from the inception of the colony up until 1690. At 1690, the number of slaves in the colony surpassed the number of indentured servants. By 1705, slaves were were a large majority of the labor in the colony. And by 1720, slaves had almost entirely displaced indentured servants as labor on farms in the colony here and in Queen Anne's County. That drastically changed the way the farms operated. Indentured servants, and I never realized this until I did this research for this thing. I started work for my grandfather when I was 8 years old. And when I was very small, I didn't work every day. But when I got old enough to drive, I worked for him every day. And we worked a work week of 5 days, Monday through Friday, Saturday until noon or dinner time. And that's the exact work week of an indentured servant. They also got holidays off, some holidays. If you could see my paycheck from my grandfather from up until I was about 30 years old, then I would probably have qualified as an indentured servant. When slave labor was brought into the picture, slaves worked 6 days a week. They didn't get the half day off on Saturday. They also got many less holidays. And for the, I guess you could say, cruelest of the planters out there, they had the slaves working on Sundays too, but the majority of planters would allow the slaves to have Sunday off. So now you're getting to the point where the productivity on all the farms is increasing just because the labor pool was being asked to work longer than what had been done previously. Let's see. So productivity off of the farm increased pretty dramatically once slaves were brought back. When indentured servants were doing the labor on the farm, it was said that one farm hand could produce 7 barrels of corn in one growing season. 1720, slaves are in charge, and from 1720 until 1770, that production increased from 7 barrels per farm hand to 20 barrels per farm hand. At that point, now we got enough surplus there that we're not just subsistence farming. There's corn available on the farms to be exported. And corn was exported from this area down to the West Indies. Tobacco is still a major crop. Tobacco stayed a major crop here in the midshore until about the mid-19th century, about 1850. Also, by this time, the stumps and the roots had rotted on a great percentage of the farmland that had been cleared. You could use a plow now pretty regularly. You could use draft animals. The animals were now penned up. They were fed some of this corn that was being grown. The manure was able to be gathered and taken out and spread on the fields and increased the fields. So that shortened up the rotation and again made the ground more productive than it had been in the early parts of the colony. From 1675 until 1825, about the only form of industrial activity there was on the shore from Kent County all the way down to Worcester County and Somerset County were mills like the old White Mill. There was very, very little other industrial activity. And this was primarily due to the fact that we also had the seafood industry. We had access to the bay, access to the river. Seafood was a huge economic driver throughout the history of Queen Anne's County. The only county on the shore that did have significant industrial production was Cecil County. And the reason for that was Cecil County did not have the access to the waters like we did. So the seafood wasn't there. They couldn't produce that economic activity, so they had to get it somewhere else. They were also a little bit closer to higher population areas, and it could generate more demand for the industrial products and ship it to the people that needed it easier. Mills, they milled corn. I'm preaching to the choir here, corn and all manner of grains. Grains started to be produced once the ground could be tilled and worked by animals. Small grains they're a little more sensitive to how they're planted and how they're grown than say corn would be. Corn was still almost entirely harvested by hand until the late 1800s even, whereas small grains, their harvest started to be mechanized in the early 1800s. The first major change was, well, the way small grain was harvested in the early 19th century up until about, say, 1840, was either by a sickle or a scythe. And the sickle, if you were harvesting with a sickle, you took one hand and grabbed hold of a bundle of wheat, and the other hand had the sickle in it, and you cut it off, and then you would take it and lay it in a windrow or a swath. Later on, someone would come along, it was called a bander would come along, and we would gather up a bundle of this wheat, and he would have a much smaller bundle of wheat in his hand or her hand, because a lot of the banders were women. And you would lay the larger bundle across 90 degrees to the smaller bundle, tie the small bundle in a knot, and you would create, it was called a bundle. And then the bundles could be gathered up and stored in a shock. And the shocks were more weatherproof than laying it all spread out in the field. The shocks would then be gathered up and taken somewhere to be threshed. There's three different operations involved with getting the grain from the field to a condition where it can be milled. And the first one is reaping. That would have been used with the sickle or the scythe. The second is threshing, and threshing is separating the grain from the straw. And then the third operation would be winnowing, and the straw is much larger than the grain, so you could use some type of physical barrier like a screen or something like that to separate the grain from the straw. But the chaff in the straw were almost the same size, so you couldn't use that. But the grain was much heavier than the chaff, so you could use air to separate the chaff from the grain. So when it was winnowed, that was the separating of the chaff from the grain. At that point, then you have a product that you can take to the mill and have it milled into flour. So the first major invention was called a cradle scythe. And the scythe is, when you're using it, I explained how you use a sickle to harvest. I didn't explain the scythe. So the scythe is basically a knife that's probably 24 to 26 inches long, and it's hooked onto a handle that's probably 3 to 4 feet long. And you use both hands and you swing it, and you're cutting the grain as close to the ground as you can cut it without hitting the ground. And at that point, the grain is laying on the ground. It has to be gathered up and put into the windrow. And then the bundlers come along and tie it in bundles. The rest of the process is exactly the same. Well, when in 1823, the cradle scythe was invented, and that was the same knife and handle arrangement, but then behind it, they would put about 4 or 5 fingers. That was enough that when you swung the scythe through the small grain, the cut grain would fall into this cradle, and you didn't have to pick it up off the ground. You were already holding it and it was all oriented in the same direction. So you would take the scythe, you'd swing it through the grain, you would cut some, and then you would dump it into the windrow. And then the rest of the process was exactly the same as with the sickle. The bundlers would come along and tie it into bundles by hand, and then put the bundles into a shock. And then at some time later, the shocks would be gathered brought up to the farmstead and threshed into grain. So in 1831, first really big invention was the reaper. And the reaper mechanized, reaping is the first part where the sickle or the size used to cut the grain. So Cyrus Hall McCormick invented a reaper which had a reciprocating knife in it and would move through the field and cut the grain all in at one motion. I didn't mention before, the cradle side, when it was invented, that tripled the output of one man over a regular side or a sickle as far as reaping the grain. So one man at that point could harvest about 2 acres of small grain a day. The reaper's invented. It's pulled by draft animals, normally pulled and sometimes pushed by draft animals, depending on the type of hitch that it had. And it moves across the field and cut the grain, and it falls down. And with the 2 draft animals and a reaper, one person could reap about 20 acres of grain a day. So that was a massive improvement over what was available up until then. And that really made small grain, wheat, rye, barley, and other grains like that cash crops. Now you're not just producing it for yourself, but you have enough that you can produce and sell something. Tobacco is still a major crop in the colony. Stayed as a major crop here in the midshore until about 1850. Was still grown here on the shore. There's one farmer right outside of Queenstown that was still growing some tobacco in the 1970s, but he stopped growing in the 1970s, and there was no tobacco grown here that I'm aware of from that point on. What's the next big invention? In 1837, most of you have heard of a blacksmith from Vermont named John Deere. John Deere largely went bankrupt in Vermont. Too many blacksmiths, didn't have enough work. He's a man trying to make a living with a wife and 5 children, and he sells his blacksmith shop to his father-in-law, and he heads out west, leaving his wife and his 5 children there in Vermont. He settled in Grand Decatur, Illinois, and he did that because there was not another blacksmith shop within 40 miles in any direction. And he set up a blacksmith shop out there in Grand Decatur. And after a short period of time, he sent for his wife and children, and he started a business there as a blacksmith. In 1837, he was doing some work in a sawmill as a blacksmith, and he saw a broken saw blade that was laying there. The ground out in Illinois and in the Midwest is dramatically different than it is here. Plows at that time, when they were made out of cast iron. Cast iron is very brittle. It breaks easily. You break the plow, you were basically done. You had to have another moldboard built by a blacksmith. It does not scour easily. Anybody that's ever seen a plow when it's being used, and I was fortunate enough that my grandfather plowed until I was probably about 25 years old. So I know the art of plowing, and it is an art. And when a plow has been pulled through the ground for about 15 or 20 minutes and it's properly scoured, it'll be just as bright as a mirror. Out in the Midwest, the soil was very much stickier. It didn't clean off of the moldboard like it did here. Plows the cast iron plows didn't work very well out there. He saw this saw blade laying out there, and he asked the sawmill owner if he could have that saw blade. And it wasn't any good to him, so yeah, you can have it. And he took it back to his blacksmith shop, and he fashioned it into a plow bottom. And he hooked this plow bottom to a plow frame, and he had a piece of ground there that he hooked a couple draft animals up to it, and by golly, it scoured up pretty as anything you ever saw right there in that mucky Midwest soil. So the steel plow was invented. In 1837, he built one. By 1841, he had built about 400 of them. He's still producing them, and it's right there around 1841. he goes into the manufacturing business because prior to 1841, he was still producing them only on order, not speculation. By 1855, John Deere's producing 13,000 plows a year, and he's selling them all over the country and never looked back. Well, the plows came here to Maryland. They came to Queen Anne's County. They made the life of tilling the soil much easier. Not only were they more durable than the cast iron plows, not only they did a better job, but they were built in a fashion that if you broke part of them, you didn't have to go to a blacksmith and have a whole new plow built. You could buy the part that was broken and just replace that one part. They were built on a pattern rather than individually. Another big change, 1849. 1849, the tin can was invented, and canning on an industrial scale came into being. By 1850, Baltimore City is the canning capital of the world. There were a ton of canneries in Baltimore City, and that changed agriculture here in the shore dramatically, because now we could grow vegetable crops, which prior to that had to be sold as a fresh crop and could only be sold when the crop was ready to go, and the person that bought it could only keep it as long as it would stay fresh. Now that crop can be canned, and it can be saved for a considerable amount of time and shipped to many, many locations, still in a condition where it's tasty when it comes out. Canneries did eventually come over to the shore in the probably 1875 to 1880s when they started canning over here. Big canning crops, seafood was by far the largest canning crop here on the shore. More seafood canned than anything else, and it was shipped pretty much all over the world. Tomatoes were second. Used to be a ton of tomatoes grown around here. The last tomato cannery that I can remember around here was Friel's right in Queenstown. The Friel's had the tomato cannery in Queenstown. They had the sweet corn cannery in Y Mills. And then there was another sweet corn cannery over in Hillsborough. Only one still operating is Friel's Cannery there in Y Mills, and it is one of the largest sweet corn canneries in the country. And I believe it's the largest one east of the Mississippi. It takes about 9,000 acres of corn now to supply that cannery for what they want to put up for their annual production. So corn, seafood, tomatoes, string beans was a huge canning crop. Lima beans, greatly diversified the agriculture here on the shore. Larger farms, once the slave labor had started, some of the farms got much larger. By this time, most of the farms are tenant farmed, and they're getting smaller again. And again, there's a family tilling the farm with a little bit of hired labor. Slavery was outlawed in Maryland in 1864, so there wouldn't have been any slaves used. All the labor at that point would either be family labor or hired labor. At one time, there was over 300 canneries here on Delmarva. There's still some frozen food operations, but as far as I know, there's only one cannery left, and that's the Friel's Cannery right there at Y Mills. Next big invention, and this was a huge improvement for the mills, was the reaper binder, because now you got the reaper had been cutting the wheat, but now you've got a machine that will mechanically gather the wheat into a bunch and tie a string around it. The first binders that were invented were wire. They didn't stick around very long, because if you didn't get all the wire out, then the wire went through the threshing machine and got chewed up into little bits and got spread throughout the grain. And that doesn't do very good for the millstone, and it doesn't do very good for the people that have to eat the flour either. So wire didn't stick around very long as tying bundles. It was soon changed to twine. One of the earliest memories that I have with my grandfather is going to the Threshermen's Reunion over in Federalsburg and watching the threshing machine over there work hooked to a steam engine. And I thought that was one of the most fascinating things I had ever seen. And they were tossing the bundles of wheat into the threshing machine with twine still on them. And my grandfather made a point. He did work. He was born in 1905 and died in 1997. And he said that if you got caught throwing bundles of wheat into the threshing machine with the string still tied on them, they'd find something much less pleasant for you to do for the rest of the day. So you learned that lesson pretty quick. The reaper binder was pulled by horses or mules. Later on, they were used on up into the tractor era. Probably, they were used up into the 1940s, but used almost exclusively, I would say, up until the 1930s is really when the combine came into a widespread use around here. So reaper binders were still used up until that point. Threshing crews would have a crew on there of about 30 people. That would be the engineer, the crew actually operating the threshing machine, other crews hauling the grain out of the field up to the thresher. There would be at least 2 crews hauling the grain. The grain was, after it came out of the thresher, it was put into a burlap bag and sewed shut. And those burlap bags had to be hauled away from the threshing machine. So there would be at least 2 wagons doing that. Threshers were still pretty common here in the midshore up until the 1930s. In the 1930s, combines came on, and my grandfather did work on a threshing crew for a few seasons. Power in the thresher was steam engines. Steam engines were invented in the early 1800s. They were not widely used in agriculture until the late 1800s. At that time, there was a number of sawmills and threshing machines and other things that they could be used. They were used primarily here as stationary machines. Out in the Midwest, they were used as both stationary and draft machines. So they would pull plows, harrows, and other things across the field and till the ground up. They also used distillate engines, which would run on kerosene. My great uncle had a Rumley oil pull. Was the biggest Rumley oil pull that was made. I think it was a 3060. It ran on a thresh machine. The distillate engines were more user friendly from the respect that they didn't use very much water. Threshing machines or steam engines used a tremendous amount of water, but a steam engine could burn pretty much any fuel there was laying around. They ran on wood, straw, and coal. The distillate engine ran on kerosene, and you had to haul the kerosene to it. The downside to it was the farmers were so tight that they wouldn't let the engine sit there and run when they went to dinner at the high noon. And the engine would be so hot that when you came back to the machine, you usually got an hour for dinner. And when you came back to the engine, it would be seized up and it would be very, very difficult to restart. And my great uncle suffered from a bad back in the last part of his life. And my grandfather always attributed that to starting that dang old Rumley oil pull. It was just very, very difficult to get started. Once it was easy to start the first thing in the morning, and it probably burned 1 or 2 quarts of kerosene if it would have been sitting there idling while they went to lunch. So they couldn't have that. World War I brought on a big change in agriculture also, because we had big movement of labor off the farms into the military and into the industrial complex to produce the equipment that was needed for the war. It increased the need for mechanization in agriculture, and all the agriculture equipment providers at that time fell right in and started producing smaller tractors. The big steam engines, the big distillate engines, they were very, very expensive, very rare for one single farm to own one of them. That's why the threshing crews moved from one farm to another. A big threshing run would be 3 farms. If you had a smaller machine or the farms were smaller, you might go to as many as 12 farms in a threshing run. Very, very few small farms could afford anything like that. So that's why the equipment was shared, and it was basically done on a custom basis. You would pay the thresher to come in and thresh your grain when it was ready. The important part of it was small grain can only sit in the field until it's ripe. Once it ripens, every time it rains on that small grain, the quality of it goes down. The flour yield drops, the protein amount in the grain drops. So once that grain ripens, you have to get it harvested. That's why a lot of the farms had reapers and reaper binders. They could get the grain out of the field when it was ready or get it into a shock. Sometimes it was put into a barn. But once it was put into a condition where it could resist the weather, it could sit there safely for a relatively long period of time, say a month or two, until the threshing crew got to your farm and could thresh it out. If it stood in the field that way, the quality of the grain would be bad enough that it really wouldn't have much of a milling quality. It wouldn't produce very much flour. So World War I spurred the development of smaller tractors that every farm could afford. And at that point, in the early 20s, every farm's not buying a tractor, but the tractors at that point were basically draft machines and stationary power machines. They hadn't developed a way to get the power of the engine to a piece of equipment to drive it and move it through the field at the same time. They could pull plows, they could pull disc harrows, they could pull spring tooths and do work of the draft animals in the field, usually at a much lower cost than keeping a draft animal. What kept farmers from widespread acceptance of tractors early on was the fact that you couldn't cultivate with a tractor. It was a draft machine, and once the crop came up, you couldn't put the tractor in the field. Corn at that time was cultivated at least 3 times. There were no crop care chemicals, so no herbicides out there to keep the weeds down. And the only way to do it was to cultivate the corn to keep the weeds down until the corn got tall enough that it could shade the ground. At that point, once the canopy formed, then weed growth would be much, much slower because the corn was denying it sunlight. These early tractors you could not put in once the corn had come up. So you had to keep the draft animals there to do the cultivation. So farmers would not buy a tractor to do this heavy work and then keep the animals on the farm just for the cultivation. If the animals had to be there anyway, well, they just as well do the draft work too and use them for a longer period of time during the year. That all changed in 1924. So a lot of companies had been trying to find a way to put a tractor in a field with a growing crop and cultivate this crop. International Harvester was one of the biggest company at that time producing farm equipment, and they invented a thing called the motor cultivator. It was a disaster. It was big, it was heavy, it was cumbersome, it was unreliable and not satisfactory at all. In 1921, the chairman of International Harvester Company put all the engineers to work. We have to develop some type of machine that can go through the field and cultivate this corn. And by 1923, they had come up with, it's called a Farmall Regular, and it's the first tractor that was developed that resembles what we know as tractors today. It had a narrow front end with the two front wheels very close together. They could fit down between a row of corn, and then the two back wheels were out wide, and they would run into other rows of corn. You could drive the tractor through the cornfield and not knock the corn down. So they developed cultivators that went on there, and these early cultivators went on the front of the tractor. And so as you turn the steering wheel, the cultivator would move just a little bit left and right. It was a lot easier to keep it in line to not tear the corn up. It also had a PTO, power takeoff is what PTO stands for. It would allow you to hook a piece of equipment behind the tractor, and the shaft would turn that piece of equipment and cause it to move. You didn't have to have a separate engine on the piece of equipment to get it to work. It was a huge economic success. The first row crop tractor that was developed. And by 1924, it's in full production. It was the reason that International Harvester decided that they had to develop this type of tractor was because Henry Ford at that time is producing the Fordson tractor and selling it as cheap as he was the Model T car. And he was doing the same thing with the agriculture industry, and realized that Henry Ford's father was a farmer and he grew up on a farm, and he was determined to lessen the workload of early farmers. So he built this tractor, and it could do the draft work. And he sold it as cheaply. He built it on an assembly line the same way he did the Model T, and he sold it way cheaper than anybody else was selling tractors at the time. And it was also an economic success. International Harvester developed the Farmall Regular to compete with that tractor, and it did so. And it actually supplanted the Fordson as by far the most successful tractor that had come along from that time. The Farmall Regular, the next iteration of it was called the F20. So International came out with an F30, which was a bigger tractor, and then an F12, which was a very small tractor. So now we had a whole line of tractors that you could purchase for any specific job on your farm. Now farmers were getting interested in using tractors because they could use them year round, and they were much more cost efficient. Sorry about my throat. I've been talking all day long, and my voice is kind of giving up on me now. But in 1924, when the Farmall Regular was put into full production, they also came out with a line of attachments that went with it: cultivators, mowers, planters. Planters up until this point had not been pulled by tractors. They were almost exclusively pulled by horses. The Regular was produced, the Regular and then the F series after that were produced until 1939. And in 1939, International came out with the Letter series, and that's the tractors that you see at a lot of steam shows and so forth now. And that's the ones that really resemble the tractors that we use today. My grandfather started farming on his own in the 1930s, and he started farming with horses. I have a receipt of his from 1944 where he traded a pair of mules and all of the associated equipment that went with those mules into the farm equipment dealer for a used tractor, and all of the equipment that went with that used tractor for $400. So post World War I, the farm equipment dealers are trying to get the farmers away from draft animals and into farm equipment. So every farm equipment dealer that was around had a livery stable, and you could trade animals in on tractors. And those animals would either be resold to other farmers or they would be sent to the market. But there was a place at all the farm equipment dealers where these animals could stand until such time as they could, their next job was determined. In 1939, in the United States, 30 million people lived on farms, and there were 1.2 million tractors on farms. Second World War, again, another driver, just like the First World War, pulling labor off of the farms to the cities and into the military. Production goes into the military. By 1950, we only have 23 million people on the farm. So in a span of 11 years, 7 million people moved off the farms into a more industrial job. And we have 4 million tractors on the farms. Just by 1950, we're almost entirely mechanized. The next really big invention that revolutionized grain production was the combine. And the combine was actually invented in 1836 in Michigan, but it wasn't marketed very well. It wasn't patented, and it didn't go anywhere. By 1875, there are there are pull-type combines used primarily in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest. These combines are pulled by horses. Between 30 and 36 horses it took to pull one of these combines across the field. The amount of labor that it took to run these combines was huge. 40-man crews to both tend to the combine and to take the grain away from it because again, the grain is, as it's separated, it's put into burlap bags, sewed up, and all this grain usually they were dropped in the field, and you had to go along and pick them up, put them on a wagon, and haul them in to be stored. The first self-propelled combine was invented in 1911 by Holt and Company, and that Holt was a California operation. These self-propelled combines, again, were very, very large, very, very heavy, weighed up to 30,000 pounds, which in that day was huge. They were used in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest. Again, the same place the big pull-type combines were used. They were much too large to be able to afford around here. So the grain around here still being harvested the same way it always was and taken into the mill. The first smaller self-propelled combine was introduced with the Farmall Regular, or right after the Farmall Regular, by the International Company. It was a combine that was built to be pulled through the field by the tractor. It's called a pull-type combine. It ran off of the PTO, and that made combines affordable for smaller farms and for farms in our midshore area. So at that time, the grain harvest is almost entirely mechanized. The combine harvests the grain in the field. Again, the grain is still sacked, put into a burlap bag. So you still have two people on there putting the grain, well, one person driving the combine on the tractor, and then two people on the combine sacking the grain and tying the sacks up and dropping them in the field. They're much, much smaller than the ones that were out west, or more affordable. That was the primary way grain was harvested around here. And that's what started to put the threshing crews out of business, because now you got a 3-man crew harvesting probably 30 acres of small grain in a day, whereas the reapers were down around 20 acres per day. Massey Harris was the first one to put a bin on a combine so you could harvest this grain in bulk and then auger it directly from the combine into a truck or onto a wagon. You eliminated the two people that were on the side of the combine sacking the grain and tying the sacks up. That was another big innovation right there. At that point, grain is harvested largely like it's still harvested today. It's just, and you might recognize the combines down there look vaguely similar to what we're using today. But just on a much, much smaller scale. So the last big innovation this is especially true for the shore, and it's really what put animal agriculture out of business on the shore and brought in entirely grain production, which is what we have today. I grew up, as I said, working for my grandfather, and one of his large businesses was hauling livestock. And I spent the first 55 years of my life hauling livestock all over this country. And when I started into it, there were livestock on a significant number of farms in the midshore area. There were still dairy farms here. Now I think there's 2 dairy farms left in Queen Anne's County is all that's left here. In 1962, a friend of mine's father was a breeding technician for an artificial insemination outfit at that time. And he said from Centerville to Wye Mills on 213, every single farm had a dairy and every single farm had cows on it. And now there's 3 dairies left in the county because the third one's Reed Leverton right down there in Wye Mills. And that's the only dairy that's left in this area now. The number of animals around here is very, very small compared to what it was when I was younger. And the reason for that is the broiler industry. It started down in Salisbury, or actually Ocean View, Delaware is where it started. It started in the early 1920s, and the broiler industry really started as a mistake, but it caught on. Up until the 1930s, chicken was very rarely eaten as a protein source, chicken itself. The eggs were the protein source, and chickens were almost entirely raised as eggs. You could not find chicken meat. The only time you ate a chicken is when the chicken wasn't going to produce eggs anymore. So you just as well put it in the pot and eat it. And let me tell you, at the time a chicken has produced eggs to the end of its expectancy, there isn't much chicken left to eat. It's not really much fit to eat. But broiler chickens were raised for their meat. By the mid 1930s, there were 34 million broiler chickens produced on Delmarva. Take that on up to 2006, there were 570 million broiler chickens produced on Delmarva. That chicken industry developed a market for corn and soybeans that we had never seen before. And at that point, we can't leave significant areas of the farm in pasture. The return that can come from that ground from a grain crop that's grown and sold for a cash crop is so much greater than what the pasture could produce in terms of meat or milk or fiber or whatever it is you're taking off of it, that animal agriculture really didn't become viable around here anymore. If you go into Pennsylvania, there's still a lot of animal agriculture up there. Their ground up there, it slopes on it don't make it nearly as hospitable to farming, much more subject to erosion. So if you can leave it in grass and run animals on it, you'll get a better return on it. So seeing how I've gone over my time, sorry about that. I guess I can take a few questions if you want me to, or if it's over, it's over. So I'll leave that up to the powers that be.
No, I'll speak up and just say we would love to have time for questions as long as people are willing. You've raised so many fascinating issues. I want to thank you very much for, I've learned a huge amount in the past hour about all different aspects of agriculture. And I think many people will have questions. And I'm not sure exactly how we do this, but if we anybody wants to raise their hand either physically or using their device, we will call upon people and we can spend a few minutes. Ellen, are you raising your hand too?
I am raising my hand. I'm raising my finger. I don't know where
Okay.
I did do it on the device. But there, you mentioned a sweet corn cannery in Wye Mills. Where is that? A field?
It's on Grange Hall Road. If you go 213 towards Centerville, it's the first road north of Route 50. So you
Where
turn
the,
right on that road and you go
Osprey is?
back there about a mile.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you. I didn't
Been
know that.
there, yeah, it's been there since the early 1900s.
Wow.
I've driven by that and I didn't know what that was. It's right down the road from the 7-Eleven, the gas station.
Yep, go past the 7-Eleven,
Yeah.
and then the first thing you come to is a set of fuel tanks there on the right. And that's a fuel transfer spot for a local home heating oil company. And then behind it is a huge warehouse. That's the latest addition to the cannery. And then as you come next to it, it's the cannery, sweet corn, and it's entirely sweet corn now. My grandfather had a trucking business, and I used to haul cans into it and sweet corn out of it back in the early or late 1970s and early 80s. So I was familiar with the process then. Back in that period of time, there was about somewhere between 400 and 450 people employed there, largely college students and other laborers. Due to mechanization and the fact that it's harder and harder to get labor for them now, they're down somewhere closer to about 125 people now. There's probably 30 people that work there year round, just in that cannery.
They used to sell the canned goods by Frail's Lumber Company in a separate building. I don't know if they still do.
It probably do. I'm really not sure. I can find out. I have a friend of mine that works for Friel. So, but yeah, they used to sell canned goods right there at the lumber company.
Is she the one
And the
that
tomato cannery used to be right there with the lumber company. They closed it up somewhere around 20 or 25 years ago. They stopped canning tomatoes.
did your friend answer the phone? Frail's.
Yeah, I know her. She's been there a long time. No, she's the one I get when I call over there for them. Yeah. Yeah.
I
She's been
don't
doing that
remember
job
ever
for-
seeing their product in stores, however.
You can find it in stores occasionally, but more likely it's going to be a store brand.
Mm.
So they have a whole labeling line out there. They have 2 or 3 labeling lines where they put the labels on the can. So it's more likely to be whatever the Signature Select or an Acme brand or something that's a store brand rather than the Friel's brand.
All right. Thank you for that.
You talked about thinning corn. And am I right in assuming that that was never mechanized? And
No.
eventually it wasn't mechanized because they stopped thinning. They did stop, they don't need to thin
Well,
anymore.
I don't know how you would mechanize that, because you have to go through
Yeah.
and make a visual assessment of which one of the corn plants is going to be the best one to keep, and then
Right.
the runs you
That
pull
takes
out.
human. Okay.
Yeah.
My mother talks about thinning corn,
Yeah,
and that would have been in the 20s or 30s.
that's correct.
Okay, so they would it wasn't that my grandfather was a poor farmer. It was that was still done that way.
Well,
that
it
method.
was done when corn was checked. So there was check planters. They were special types of planters, and they dropped corn so you could cultivate it 2 ways. When corn stopped being checked, when it was planted just in straight rows, that's when thinning stopped.
Okay. Cool.
Any other questions? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of this insight. I think those of us who are welcoming visitors to Old Y Mill now have a great deal more to tell our visitors about the processes that brought the grain to the mill over a very long period of time. At this point, I want to introduce John Nizer, our board president, just to say some final words and remind us of the upcoming activities, next week's last speaker, and then the opening day of the mill. Be here before you know it.
Okay, thank you. For those people that are thinking about volunteering at the mill, we will have a volunteer day training on Saturday, the 9th of April. And the next big event after that would be opening day on April the 30th. We will have more of a low-key opening day this year than we did last year, but we're going to have on June the 18th, which is a Saturday, we're going to have the Wheat Harvest Festival, and it'll be colonial reenactors and music and different things going on there. So anyone who's interested in volunteering, please go to our website and sign up to be a volunteer. Thank you, Barry. And thank everyone for coming in tonight. And our last series is April the 7th, and that's going to be about Oliver Evans with Steve Charles.
Yeah, so that'll be very, very interesting. And with that, thank you all very much. We'll see you next week on April 9th at 9:30, if I'm not mistaken, John,
That is
is
correct.
the volunteer workshop. And that will also involve the introduction of the family discovery backpacks that we've talked about, family activity backpacks. So I hope everybody will be able to participate. There'll be a lot of other important updates. So thank you all very much. Appreciate having you. It's great to get together. We'll see you next week.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Thank you, John. Very well
Thank you, John.
done.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.